What's up guys, welcome to another range day. Today I'm going to be updating my ultimate 9mm PCC comparison rankings with a new challenger, my brand new CMMG Dissent. Guys, if you enjoy the content that I'm making, then please make sure to like and subscribe and leave me a message down in the comments section. I hate asking, but it really does help with the algorithm a lot, so I would really appreciate it. And if you ring the bell icon, you should get notifications when new videos are released as well. Additionally, if you want to get more Chester's Hobbies content, you can follow me on Instagram where you can see what I'm working on and get previews of upcoming videos. And I'm also pretty active on Reddit if you'd like to follow along with the conversations there. Alright, well that's enough of that, so back to the video of the day. Let's talk about some of my favorite 9mm Pistol Caliber Carbines and see how the CMMG Dissent stacks up against the competition. Now if you haven't seen it already, I would highly recommend checking out my original Ultimate 9mm PCC comparison video, which I'll link here and in the description, as it really sets the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. Basically, I'm going to be using the same format and rankings that resulted from that video, but then plugging the CMMG Dissent into the mix and seeing where it stands. As I mentioned in that video previously, 9mm Pistol Caliber Carbines are my absolute favorite guns to shoot because the ammo is relatively affordable. Many PCCs are light and handy, can be shot rapidly at steel up close, and suppress very well. So they really do tick just about all the boxes for me when it comes to fun and interesting guns to run at the range. Beyond that, a lot of people also find them to be a practical way to train effectively with less expensive 9mm ammunition that is more affordable than something like 5.56 that a lot of people might be running in their primary rifles. And others swear by 9mm Pistol Caliber Carbines for home defense, especially if their PCC of choice shares magazines with their preferred sidearm. Any way you look at it, 9mm Pistol Caliber Carbines are extremely popular and I'm very passionate about them, so that's why I'm making these videos. Now as a reminder and a bit of an obvious disclaimer here, please keep in mind that everything I'm talking about today is going to be my personal opinions based on my experiences over the course of several years of ownership for most of these firearms, as well as my own personal preferences. For example, as I've mentioned before, I tend to prefer longer handguards that provide additional leverage for my support hand when controlling recoil, so something like that could potentially color my opinions a bit when I'm comparing these firearms. But another thing that I want to point out here is that the guns we're going to be comparing today, in my opinion, represent the absolute pinnacle of technology and performance available for pistol caliber carbines in 2024, so right out of the gate, a lot of the differences we're going to be discussing are honestly very minor differences at the end of the day, but there are definitely some interesting differences worth discussing, so let's get into it. So much like before, we're going to be focused on 6 primary categories that I'll be ranking these guns in today. Those categories include recoil impulse, sight movement or target reacquisition, trigger, manual of arms and ergonomics, customizability, modularity, and aftermarket, and suppressor host effectiveness. Now for the trigger category, we're actually going to do 2 separate rankings. One for the stock trigger as it comes from the factory, and another one that considers available trigger upgrades, and I'll show you how that affects the final rankings as well. Each gun will be receiving a rank from 1 to 11 in each individual category, with 1 being the best and 11 being the worst for that particular category. Once we've gone through all the categories, I'll add up the scores and see how they rank against each other based on my opinions and experiences in the categories that I've set up here. Now there may be a couple of categories that you would think should be here that I've omitted, so let's talk about that. I'm not including value as part of this comparison because that's a little too subjective in my opinion, and prices tend to fluctuate frequently enough for that to not be a sustainable commentary over time. So while I may make some general subjective statements of value as we go, my primary recommendation would be to look at the categories, determine what matters most to you, see how everything adds up, and then decide if the current price difference between different options you're considering is worth it to you. I'm also not including accuracy because in my experience, all these guns have pretty similar performance out to 100 yards, which is roughly their effective range. And so in my opinion, their triggers and recoil impulse, as well as the individual pulling the trigger, will have a greater effect on practical accuracy than bench resting for groups. We are, however, going to be taking a look at some rapid-fire groups at 10 yards to try to get an idea of the performance differences between these firearms and that sort of rapid-fire CQB style application, which is really where I think a lot of these guns excel. Now, getting into the guns that we'll be discussing today, I would encourage you to check out my PCCs playlist to view all of the individual videos for any firearm you're interested in for a deeper dive into each one. And again, my original Ultimate 9mm PCC comparison video featured a detailed breakdown of every gun across all 6 categories. Obviously, the primary objective today is to take that original list and insert the new CMMG Dissent into the mix and see how it lines up with the rest of the competition. And based on my experience shooting the CMMG Dissent in my first shots video, I've put a limit on the guns that I'm testing today to really focus on picking apart the experience of shooting the Dissent with the guns that I think it's most closely matched with based on performance and feel. So essentially what I'll be doing today is directly comparing the CMMG Dissent against the top 5 from my previous comparison video, basically omitting any of the direct blowback style options and focusing on firearms that feature some form of delayed blowback operation for a more even playing field. build. That said, the final rankings will still include the original list of PCCs, so if you want to see the test that I conducted with those other firearms, I would recommend checking out the original video. So the guns that the CMMG Dissent will specifically be challenging today are the PTR-9CT, representing a wide variety of full-size MP5 clones and variants, the PTR-9KT, representing a wide variety of MP5K clones and variants, the Sig Sauer MPX-K, the 5-inch CMMG Banshee 300, and lastly, the ever-popular Wildcard, my custom 8-inch CMMG Banshee build, which will again not be included in the primary rankings, but will have its own rankings included at the end of the video. Also included in the overall rankings today, but not featured in this video, are the B&T APC-9 Pro, the CZ Scorpion Evo 3S1, the Kalashnikov USA KP9 or Vitesse, the PSA AKV, the Chris Vector, and the B&T TP9N. If you're interested in hearing more about these guns specifically, you're going to want to pull up my original comparison video for details on those. Now, just like last time, I made sure to do everything possible to create a nice even playing field for the comparison today. All of these guns are registered SBRs that have been configured in ways to make them highly effective for me personally, so they all have comfortable links of pull using my favorite stocks for each platform, and they all have effective vertical grips. Now, as I talk about the guns, I'm going to be rolling in some footage from previous videos that I've done, but to really give every gun here a fair shake and attempt to remove any perceived bias or rose-tinted glasses effects, I'm going to be doing a couple of tests with all of these guns here today to refresh my memory on what each gun feels like to shoot, which will help me solidify my thoughts and comparisons. So the first thing that I'm going to do is some recoil, trigger, and sight movement tests. For these tests, I'm going to be doing 2 sets of 5 rounds rapid fire at 10 yards with each gun, 1 unsuppressed and then 1 suppressed with my Dead Air Wolfman in short configuration. We'll slow down the footage to compare recoil and sight movement and also take a look at the groups on steel to see which ones are moving around on me more. For the unsuppressed tests, I'll also be using a shot timer to see how fast I'm able to run the guns. And then I'm going to do a suppressed sound test in an attempt to test the differences in sound and tone to determine which of these guns are the best suppressor hosts. For those tests, I'll be doing 5 shots each, slow fire into the dirt so you don't hear any steel distracting from the sound of the gun, this time using the Dead Air Wolfman in its long configuration for maximum suppression. Once we've done all that, I'll be heading back inside to analyze the performance and feel of each of these guns, figure out where the CMMG Dissent ranks against the competition in each category, and then add up the scores and see which ones come out on top. I was really impressed with the CMMG Dissent in my first shots video, and I'm super excited to see how it stacks up to my other favorite PCCs, so let's hit the range and see how they do. Alright guys, that was a ton of fun and those tests were super interesting to experience firsthand, so we're going to dig into each individual category and see where the CMMG Dissent lands. But before we do that, I want to take this opportunity to highlight one of the biggest challenges of this sort of analysis, and that's the human factor. Like everyone else, I have good days and bad days at the range and everything in between. And that's true not just with the individual performance, but also with the performance on a specific platform on any given day. So really it's just another variable to consider when looking at the results here. So if you compare the group sizes, speed, and split times I got today versus the ones from my original comparison video, you'll probably notice that I was shooting faster and tighter groups today than I did originally. Now with the Dissent in particular, I got my fastest string of 5 shots with my fastest split times out of both sessions. Now aside from the obvious differences and variables of individual performance across separate range sessions that were filmed over a year apart from each other, there are definitely some elements of the Dissent's design that helped me achieve that result. So let's dive in. So we're starting off today with my personal favorite category, Recoil Impulse. Now as a reminder, the Recoil Impulse really represents the feel of the gun while shooting. How much of that 9mm energy is imparted on your shoulder and body, and subsequently how much of that energy is ultimately reduced by the operation mechanisms in use by that particular firearm. Now the Dissent is an extremely soft shooting gun that I could easily shoot all day with minimal fatigue. CMMG's radial delayed blowback system really does an excellent job of softening and minimizing felt recoil, and they've also done an excellent job tuning the internal recoil spring assembly to maximize the performance of the system as well. Now despite how pleasant and soft shooting it is, the reality is it's not the softest shooter out there. So I'm actually going to put the CMMG Dissent in 4th place in the Recoil Impulse category. The classic roller delayed blowback found in the MP5 and MP5K is still the king of minimizing felt recoil, which makes them a perfect choice for new shooters. And that was a result that I expected. What I was really interested in seeing is how the Dissent compares to the Banshee and the MPX. As far as how the 5-inch Banshee 300 compares to the Dissent, the felt recoil is extremely similar, guys. They both use the same radial delayed blowback setup, and the primary difference is that the Banshee has a traditional AR-style buffer, tube, and spring setup, and the Dissent has an internal recoil spring assembly that's more similar to the MPX. I went back and forth several times trying to analyze the recoil impulse difference, and ultimately I decided that with my 2 examples here, the Dissent has the slightest edge over the Banshee, but guys, they are extremely close here. And honestly, that really could just be because my Dissent is a little bit heavier than my Banshee 300 as well. What was more interesting to me was the Dissent versus the MPX, which to me feels like the most level playing field of the day here in terms of feature set, and it really almost seems like CMMG was actually targeting the MPX specifically with a lot of its design decisions. I was actually a little surprised to find that the MPX was a little bit softer shooting than the Dissent. Now I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One obvious difference is that the MPX uses a short stroke gas piston setup, which seems to do a great job at mitigating recoil on this 9mm platform. But another really interesting difference I found is when I removed the bolt and spring assemblies from both the MPX and the Dissent and weighed them side by side, the bolt and spring assembly in the Dissent weighs over 3 ounces more than the bolt and spring assembly in the MPX. So essentially what this means is that with every round fired, you've got a little bit more than 3 ounces of extra reciprocating mass in the Dissent over the MPX. Now I'll roll in some comparison photos so you can see what I'm talking about here. The Dissent's bolt carrier assembly is pretty beefed up. That may have been done to increase reliability or something, I'm not exactly sure. And I could be wrong here, but I personally believe that this contributes to a faster cycling action and softer recoil impulse in the MPX over the Dissent. And again guys, for the purposes of this comparison, I'm getting really granular here. The Dissent has one of the most pleasant recoil impulses I've ever felt in a 9mm PCC, but in my opinion, the MP5, MP5K, and MPX shoot just a little bit softer. Now getting into sight movement and target reacquisition, I personally found the Dissent to be very easy to control and keep the sights on target under rapid fire, but compared to a lot of the heavy hitters on this list, I wouldn't say that it's the flattest shooting. Looking at my previous rankings and considering the performance today, I would put the Dissent in 5th place in the sight movement category. It's slightly better than the Banshee and just behind the MP5K. The full-size MP5 still holds the crown for me here because that roller delayed action is so soft shooting and a bit slower cycling, so it just makes it really easy to keep your sights on target under rapid fire. Then there's the Crisp Vector, which uses the unique vector recoil system, which uses the weight of the bolt cycling to pull the muzzle back on target and does an excellent job of keeping the sights from moving around a lot under recoil. Then of course we have the SIG MPX, which is both soft shooting and fast cycling, which helps keep the sights steady and encourages speed, especially when shooting suppressed. And then of course there's the MP5K, which is still very soft shooting but with a shorter handguard than the full-size MP5 and a faster cycling action that in that platform makes it jump around a little bit more for me than the full-size version. Now compared to my 5-inch Banshee 300, if I had to guess, I would say that the Dissent and the Banshee are probably identical in terms of sight movement, but with my example of the Dissent having a slightly longer handguard, it gives me the ability to gain a little bit of extra leverage with my support hand to help keep the sight steady under rapid fire. Now getting into what I know is a favorite category for many of you out there, let's talk about triggers. And this is where things really get interesting for the Dissent. The CMMG Dissent comes with a brand new trigger designed by CMMG and built by Rise Armament, and it is honestly fantastic and easily one of my favorite triggers that I've ever used. Its biggest competition is definitely going to be the excellent Timney trigger in the MPX, so that's going to be the main one that I'll be comparing against here. So the Dissent trigger is a very light single stage trigger with almost no creep at all, with a very short travel followed by an extremely short, tactile, and positive reset, all of which comes together to make the Dissent nearly effortless to run fast. Now all of these things could easily be said about the MPX Timney trigger as well, so which one is better? Guys, I've got to be real with you here. They are really so close and so similar, and I've gone back and forth on this one a lot recently. Realistically, I think the average person would probably pull them side by side and almost think that they were the exact same trigger. Now, in terms of the trigger shoe, many people will probably prefer the flat face of the MPX trigger. Now, for me personally, I don't really have a major preference here, but I do often really like curved triggers as much or more than flat triggers. And so in my mind, CMMG's slightly curved but almost flat trigger is an excellent compromise. Now, in terms of pull weights, when I first got the Dissent, I measured the trigger of the Dissent against the trigger in the MPX, and the MPX trigger was slightly lighter, but keep in mind I also have thousands of rounds with that trigger already. Now that I've broken in the Dissent with several hundred rounds, they're almost identical in terms of pull weight. And then in terms of reset, I would say that the MPX trigger has a slightly shorter reset, but going back and forth, it was really hard to pick up the differences. I think in terms of feel when the trigger breaks, the MPX trigger has a little bit more of a glass breaking type feel, where the Dissent has a little bit more of a thunk type feel when you break the trigger. Neither one is necessarily better or worse, they just feel slightly different, even though they also feel almost identical, if that makes sense. Now, to be perfectly clear here, I would take either of these triggers over just about any other PCC trigger on the market today. They're both incredibly easy to run fast and precise, and so in my mind, that's a huge win for CMMG to come out with a new trigger that nearly matches the king in my eyes. So in terms of ranking here, I'm going to put the new CMMG Dissent trigger in second place, just barely behind the MPX Timney trigger because of the slightly lighter average pull weight and the very slightly shorter reset, as well as the fully flat trigger face that a lot of people seem to prefer. But guys, they really are insanely close here, so whether you're on Team SIG or Team CMMG, everyone is a winner in this race, honestly. But now things start to get shaken up a little bit here when we look back at the Banshee, which I previously ranked in 5th place for having a standard mil-spec trigger in my Banshee 300 model. But the new Banshees in 2024 ship with the exact same trigger as the Dissent that we've been talking about today. So that is actually going to move my stock trigger ranking of the Banshee up to 2nd place, tied with the Dissent for stock trigger performance. Now, in considering aftermarket triggers, I'm going to make a slight adjustment to my original list here, which won't drastically affect the overall rankings, but I think it removes some of my personal bias and taste and looks at the options a little bit more holistically. So previously I had the MPX still at number 1 in the aftermarket trigger category, with the Scorpion in 2nd and the Banshee in 3rd. But after thinking about that a little bit more over the course of the past year, the adjustment that I'm going to make is to put both the Dissent and the Banshee at number 1 for aftermarket triggers. Now the reason for this is the Banshee and the Dissent can take almost any standard AR trigger, which means there's a world of options out there for any and every user preference you could think of. While the MPX still has my favorite out-of-the-box trigger on the market, with the new Dissent and Banshee coming in at a very close second, it's really hard to deny the world of options available to end users on the Dissent and Banshee that just isn't there for the MPX because it requires a proprietary trigger setup. While in my eyes, the MPX Timney trigger is just about perfect, and by extension, I also think that the new Banshee and Dissent triggers are just about perfect as well, I do have to realize that may not be the case for everyone's personal taste, and so when it comes to aftermarket triggers, I think the pure versatility of the Banshee and Dissent really stands out and sets them apart from the competition. Now jumping into manual of arms, the Dissent is really fantastic here. It has mostly ambidextrous AR style controls, including a nice 60-degree ambi safety and oversized ambi mag releases, folding stock or brace capability with the rear 1913 Picatinny rail, and a lot of AR parts compatibility if you want to switch out any of the individual components for something else. But then it also goes a step further and adds the excellent non-reciprocating and super smooth side charging handle, which is a huge improvement over the standard ART style charging handle in terms of both general operation of the platform and also in providing a better seal for the rear of the upper receiver when shooting suppressed, which really limits the amount of gas that can get in your face under rapid suppressed fire. The bolt of the Dissent can be easily locked back without breaking your primary hand grip using the charging handle and your thumb on the bolt catch lever, and for left-handed users, the charging handle can be swapped to the right side as well. The main gripe that I have against the Dissent's manual of arms is that there's no provision for an ambidextrous bolt release lever. I tried installing a bad lever or a Phase 5 EBR lever, but the oversized ambidextrous magazine release got in the way of their operation. Now, technically, you could swap out the magazine release on the left side and install a bad lever of some sort, but as it ships from the factory, it's not ambi ready in terms of a bolt release, which is one of my primary gripes with the firearm. There are also no QD sling points on the gun at all, which is a big miss in my opinion, especially when you look at the SIG MPX lower that has a QD point machined into the lower receiver right behind the pistol grip. All that being said, guys, with all of the AR familiarity present in the Dissent and then adding the fantastic non-reciprocating charging handle, I'm ranking the CMMG Dissent in second place for manual of arms, right behind the MPX that has an ambidextrous bolt release and QD sling points from the factory, and just ahead of the Banshee that still uses the AR style charging handle. The side charger setup on the Dissent is really excellent for many reasons and almost had me placing this gun at the top of the list. Honestly, if CMMG was to update the Dissent in the future with an ambidextrous bolt release and well-placed QD sling points from the factory, I would feel very comfortable bumping it up to first place for manual of arms. But as it stands today at the beginning of 2024, I'm sticking with the MPX in first place for manual of arms and putting the Dissent in second. Now getting into what's probably the most difficult category of the day for me, let's talk about the customizability, modularity, and aftermarket for these platforms. Now like the Banshee, the Dissent has the benefit of being able to pull from thousands of available AR style parts on the market, which strictly in terms of aftermarket basically puts them in first place there. But the MPX really stands out in terms of modularity with how quickly and easily you can swap barrels and handguards, which is something that no other platform can really accomplish in the 9mm PCC space. Now the Dissent does join the MPX with the modularity, convenience, and aftermarket of a 1913 Picatinny rail mounting system for stocks and braces, which allows for the widest possible variety of folding and collapsible options for both platforms. But where things start to get really tricky is when we look at the customizability of these platforms. While the MPX does allow you to easily swap barrels and handguards at the range in minutes or seconds respectively, you're always going to be shooting it in 9mm. Now I know that for a comparison focused on 9mm Pistol Caliber Carbines, that's not necessarily an issue really, but the reality is if you go with one of the Mark IV lowers used on the Banshee and Dissent, or even use your favorite AR lower of choice, not only can you use the excellent AR style AR conversion mags from CMMG, but you could also purchase separate upper receivers that could allow you to quickly swap between 9mm, 5.56, and 300 blackout, or even 5.7x28, all on the same lower receiver, which adds a huge amount of versatility and convenience, especially if you're registering the lower receiver as an SBR. You can even buy Banshee and Dissent upper receiver kits that give you everything you need to convert your standard AR lower into a radial delayed Banshee or Dissent as well. Now a whole new upper receiver certainly isn't cheap, but it's an option that's available on the CMMG offerings discussed here and not on the rest, so it's notable for sure. So with all of that in mind, guys, I'm actually going to be making a slight adjustment to my previous rankings. I'm moving the CMMG Banshee from second place to first place, because not only do you have a whole world of AR parts availability, but you can also quickly and easily swap calibers with upper receiver changes, and you can also fully customize the buffer, tube, and spring setup like I did with my custom 8-inch Banshee to maximize your performance capabilities. So that's going to put the Dissent in second place here because it shares many of the same advantages of the Banshee with AR parts compatibility and caliber swaps, and then adds in the versatility of the 1913 Picatinny rail setup for folding stocks and braces, but then subsequently loses the ability to adjust the buffer setup to fine-tune your performance. And then finally, I'm going to be moving the MPX from first place to third place because while it does have great aftermarket support, you really can't compete with the parts availability of the AR platform. And then while the modularity of being able to swap barrels and handguards in seconds on the MPX is fantastic. There are no available caliber swapping options, which may or may not matter to everyone, but would be a definitive advantage for many, especially those registering their lower receivers as SBRs and wanting to get as much versatility as possible out of the platform. Alright, and finally we come now to the quietest category of the day, Suppressor Host Effectiveness. Now guys, the CMMG Dissent is extremely quiet suppressed. It's very pleasant and soft shooting, and so I would say it's definitely an excellent host. On top of that, removing the AR-style T-handle and replacing it with a non-reciprocating side charger provides a better seal at the rear of the upper receiver, meaning you should get less gas in the face when shooting suppressed as well. Now honestly, I'm not really the best person to ask about gas in the face with these platforms, unfortunately, because I do shoot exclusively outside, so I almost never notice gas when shooting suppressed except with the most egregious examples. There are some things that you can do to decrease gas in the face with just about any platform, like using subsonic ammunition with a low power factor and choosing a suppressor with good performance and low back pressure. With all that being said, in terms of the rankings, I would place the CMMG Dissent in 4th place here, though an argument could be made to place it in 3rd place. 1st and 2nd place still go to the MP5 and MP5K respectively, as they did before, because the roller delayed platforms are famously quiet with no gas in the face whatsoever when shooting suppressed. So for maximum suppressed performance, an MP5 is really hard to beat, honestly. Now I'm keeping the MPX in 3rd place here because to my ears, it's still quieter and softer shooting suppressed than the Banshee or Dissent options. Now both the Banshee and the Dissent are still extremely quiet, but the MPX is just a little bit quieter and softer shooting suppressed for me personally with my Dead Air Wolfman. Because of the side charging handle setup in the Dissent and the better seal on the upper receiver, I'm going to put the Dissent one ahead of the Banshee that still has that AR style charging handle. Now if you primarily shoot indoors, you might actually prefer the Dissent over the MPX because of the better seal in the upper receiver with the side charging handle setup. So the ever so slight increase in sound and recoil impulse over the MPX might be a welcome trade-off for you in exchange for the reduced gas to the face, which is exactly where you could argue to place the Dissent in 3rd place instead of 4th place here. For me personally though, shooting outside, I don't notice any gas in the face at all with either of them, so I would put the MPX in 3rd place and the Dissent in 4th place for suppressor host effectiveness. So guys, when putting all of that together and taking a look at the final rankings, the Dissent performed exceptionally well and honestly exceeded my expectations. With both stock and aftermarket triggers considered, the Dissent slides in comfortably at 2nd place overall, while also closing the gap between 1st and 2nd place to only 2 points now versus the original rankings, which had an 8-point gap between 1st and 2nd place. The MPX maintains its reign as the champion of 9mm PCCs in my testing, but the gap has definitely closed up a bit and the competition amongst the top 4 is very tight. The MPX, Dissent, Banshee, and MP5 are all phenomenal platforms that are an absolute blast to run at the range, both unsuppressed and suppressed. Now moving down the list, we still have some fantastic firearms, with the customizability of the CZ Scorpion, the smoothness and excellent manual of arms of the B&T, APC, and GHM offerings, the awesome AK-styled KP9 and AKV options, and of course the ultra-compact B&T TP9. Now I own and love all of the guns on this list enough to SBR them and solidify them as personal staples in my collection. So with that in mind, I would really still recommend any of them in the right situation with the caveats that I discussed in detail in my original PCC comparison video. Now bringing the 8-inch custom Banshee back into the mix as the Wildcard once again feels borderline unfair because that gun is just hilariously soft and flat shooting, especially suppressed. It is literally the only gun that I shot today that after completing a string of fire I couldn't help but laugh at how much the gun just simply didn't move under fire. It's absolutely insane and I love it. Obviously, the custom Banshee shares 1st place in the aftermarket trigger conversation with the Banshee 300 and Dissent, which does drop the MPX back a little bit in the rankings there, but doesn't really change the overall rankings in the end. In terms of customization and aftermarket, the ability to tune and customize the Banshee platform in just about any way that you can imagine continues to hold it above the rest of the pack in that regard. And it's still the quietest and softest shooting suppressed pistol caliber carbine that I've ever fired that isn't a roller delayed MP5 variant. So really, if you saw my previous videos, not a huge surprise here. Bringing the custom Banshee into the mix again as the wildcard maintains its position at number 1 and basically knocks everything else down a rank in the process at the expense of needing to do a custom build that can't be purchased off the shelf like the rest of the guns on this list if that's the experience that you're looking for. So that just about does it for my updated PCC rankings at the beginning of 2024 here, guys. I think the CMMG Dissent really came out swinging and performed extremely well for me today, earning a very solid second place in my primary rankings. But the reality here is these are really just my opinions, and if you're in the market for a pistol caliber carbine, you're going to want to take a close look at what matters most to you. Take a look at the categories, identify what's most important to you, see how the ones that you're considering performed for me, and then look at the current pricing on the market to see if the value is there for you. In terms of who might want to pick the Dissent over some of the other options, if you really want to shoot suppressed but you want modern style controls and minimal gas to the face, the Dissent might just be the best option for you, especially if you shoot primarily indoors and you're worried about reports of the MPX having a lot of gas to the face. If you want a fantastic single stage trigger out of the box with nearly endless opportunities for customization, the Dissent or even the Banshee is once again very easy to recommend. But at the end of the day, guys, I can confidently say that if you have or choose any of the guns on this list and you practice and train with it consistently, you're going to have a platform that's a ton of fun at the range while also being able to flex into a wide variety of other use cases like competition and self-defense with ease. So let me know what you think of my updated analysis down in the comments, and if you've had a chance to shoot a Dissent yourself, how do you think it stands against the competition? I'd really love to hear your thoughts and opinions down below. So that's going to be all for today, guys. I've got a lot more videos coming up soon, including more PCCs, AKs, ARs, handguns, and shotguns. So remember to like and subscribe, ring the bell, stay tuned, and thanks for stopping by.